The old knife certainly looked impressive. Too bad it belonged in another era. A few chuckles rippled through the clearing as Staff Sergeant Colby Marsh lifted his multi-tool for everyone to see before pointing toward the worn leather sheath hanging from an elderly man's belt. "That's the problem right there," he said with a confident grin. "A blade built for only one job. Nice piece of history, wrong century." Before the morning was over, that same outdated knife would build a shelter no one else could match, purify water faster than the expensive equipment on the demonstration table, and start a fire before Marsh even finished explaining his own process. The laughter spread quickly through the group. It wasn't loud or cruel, just the nervous kind that appears whenever people would rather blend in than question the person leading them. Within seconds it disappeared. Nearby, a kettle quietly rattled on a camp stove, completely unconcerned with the exchange. A blue jay called from the trees twice before the forest settled into silence again. No one bothered to look at the old man. Silas Dunmore offered no response. His hand rested lightly on the weathered sheath at his side, not gripping it, simply touching it with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. At 75 years old, his heartbeat never seemed to change. He had spent his life relying on equipment that had already proven itself in places Colby Marsh had never experienced. If you believe tools tested by real hardship matter more than gadgets packed with features they've never truly needed to prove, let us know in the comments. Ridgeline Readiness occupied 400 acres of rolling Appalachian foothills. For 6 summers, every weekend course had filled within an hour of opening registration. The morning carried the scent of damp hardwood mixed with instant coffee. Somewhere below the ridge, an unseen creek rushed through the valley, its sound echoing across the woods. A folding table displayed shiny survival equipment, ferro rods, a brand new pump filter still looking untouched, and a titanium cook set that had never felt the heat of an actual campfire. 30 students, dressed in fresh hiking boots and spotless outdoor clothing, formed a loose semicircle on ground already softened by years of previous classes. Many already had their phones out, ready to capture every demonstration. Marsh handled the audience with practiced confidence. The Leatherman signal clipped to his belt reflected the morning light. It had been a gift from his military unit, engraved with his initials, and throughout the morning he proudly described it as the only survival tool anyone would ever need. His confidence wasn't without reason. After 6 years running the program, 9 survival certifications, and an online audience of more than 60,000 followers, people naturally listened whenever he spoke. And he truly knew his equipment. When one student struggled to strike sparks from a ferro rod, Marsh calmly knelt beside her. Without criticism, he adjusted the angle of her wrist by only a few degrees. Less than a minute later, bright sparks showered across the tinder. Everyone watching saw exactly why he had earned his reputation. Several yards away, another group practiced with the pump water filter. Without even turning around, Marsh corrected their priming technique simply by listening to what they were doing. He had memorized the manufacturer's specifications so thoroughly that he could recite flow rates from memory. The first slight came almost casually. While checking attendance from his clipboard, Marsh glanced toward the worn leather sheath on Silas's belt. "We'll get you outfitted properly before lunch," he said, using the kind of tone salesmen reserve for customers they've already dismissed. Silas remained silent. He had heard voices like that for decades, in outdoor stores, hunting counters, and gear shops, from men young enough to be his grandsons. None of it had ever troubled him. The second remark wasn't accidental. Holding his multi-tool high for everyone to see, Marsh noticed Silas standing quietly near the back of the group. "There it is again," he announced. "Exactly what I was talking about." He pointed toward the old knife. "A blade that only learned one trick. Nice antique. Wrong century." Smiling for the phones recording him, he gave Silas a friendly slap on the shoulder. "Stick with me, old-timer. We'll bring you up to speed." More laughter drifted across the clearing. It cost the people laughing nothing. Silas never looked at Marsh. Instead, his attention moved beyond the group toward the tree-line. His eyes studied the forest with the patience of someone reading weather that had already begun to reveal itself. His hand settled once more against the old sheath. The class returned its attention to the demonstration table as if nothing important had happened. High above the trees, dark gray clouds continued gathering, moving at their own quiet pace. By mid-morning, the bright sky had turned the color of wet stone. Marsh led everyone toward a shallow depression near the edge of the woods for the shelter-building exercise. "It'll work perfectly," he explained. "Flat ground. Easy access. Plenty of room for everyone, and perfect camera angles." Silas studied the location a few seconds longer than anyone else. "That ground drains the wrong way," he said calmly. "Nothing more." He didn't point. He didn't explain. He simply knew that once heavy rain arrived, water would collect there instead of flowing away. He noticed something else as well. The students practicing with the water filter still hadn't primed it correctly. Air remained trapped inside the line, cutting its performance nearly in half. He kept that observation to himself too. No one had asked. Marsh barely glanced back while wrapping paracord around his arm. "It's flat, it's close, and we're not preparing for a hurricane," he replied. "We're building for a Saturday." A few students laughed again. Without hesitation, two of them began driving tent stakes directly into the low ground Silas had quietly warned them about. A truck door slammed somewhere near the parking area. A few moments later, footsteps approached the clearing. An older man with silver hair entered alongside a teenage girl wearing a Ridgeline Readiness t-shirt that looked several sizes too large, as though she'd chosen comfort over fit. He carried a folding stool tucked under one arm, though he never unfolded it. He had driven 3 hours simply to watch his granddaughter attend her first survival course. There was nothing flashy about him. He stood with the quiet posture of someone who had spent an entire career learning exactly how much space a person needed to occupy, and not an inch more. His eyes swept across the gathering once, calm and deliberate, before he settled near the back with his hands relaxed at his sides. No one asked who he was. No one introduced him. Noticing a new audience, Marsh raised his voice slightly and confidently explained that the low bowl of ground they had chosen was the ideal location because of its excellent drainage. Only one person there truly knew that wasn't correct. Silas. But he offered no argument. The first drops of rain began falling. At first they were scattered and harmless, just enough to send a couple of students hurrying toward their backpacks for rain jackets. "We'll adapt," he called out. "That's part of today's lesson." Silas quietly stepped away from the group. He walked toward the small rise he had noticed much earlier and crouched beside several young pine trees. Without rushing, his hands moved over one branch after another. He checked where the limbs forked. Rejected one. Picked up another several feet away. Discarded a third after feeling a tiny crack hidden beneath the bark before he even saw it. It was the effortless rhythm of someone whose hands recognized good material long before conscious thought caught up. He gathered several pieces of deadfall, weighing each one naturally as though judging them had become instinct decades ago. No one paid attention. That wouldn't last. The drizzle became real rain. Only 4 minutes later, water began rushing downhill exactly as Silas had predicted. The shallow bowl quickly filled, turning into a muddy pool beneath the tarp the students had just finished staking down. The two students inside scrambled out, already soaked. Marsh hurried toward them, shouting instructions over the increasing roar of rain striking the forest canopy. His voice struggled against the storm. Certifications meant very little to falling water. There was nowhere dry for 30 people to gather. Except one place. 15 yards uphill, Silas was already working. Without asking permission or calling attention to himself, he drew the old bayonet from its worn sheath. Placing a piece of deadfall across a rock, he struck the spine of the blade twice with another stone. The wood split cleanly down the grain. The movements were identical every time. Same angle. Same force. The result of thousands upon thousands of repetitions in places where mistakes had carried far greater consequences than a weekend training course. Another section of wood followed. Then another. Using the forked branches he had selected earlier, he quickly cut matching notches before planting them firmly into the ground. A ridge pole settled perfectly across them. He never paused to double-check measurements. He didn't need to. Half a century of experience had turned each movement into instinct. Fresh pine boughs came next. One after another they overlapped in neat layers, each covering the one beneath it like shingles on a roof. Although 75 years old, Silas worked with surprising efficiency, as though he and the approaching storm were keeping time together. A second layer followed. Then a heavier third. Each angled carefully to shed water rather than collect it. Across the clearing, the granddaughter lowered her phone from Marsh's demonstration table and turned the camera toward the hillside instead. Nearby, a woman with athletic tape wrapped around one knee completely forgot about adjusting her backpack. She simply watched. Her mouth hung slightly open as the shelter steadily took shape. The silver-haired grandfather never changed position. But his eyes followed every motion Silas made with unmistakable recognition. Rain struck the pine branches. Instead of soaking through, it rolled cleanly off the surface. By the time the heaviest downpour reached the clearing, barely 11 minutes after the first raindrop, Silas had finished. A sturdy lean-to stood on the higher ground. The floor remained dry. The structure blocked the wind. 6 people could crouch comfortably beneath it without touching the walls. Before any instructor gave directions, 3 students had already rushed inside. Silas walked straight to the pump water filter. It was still sitting where it had been left. With 2 quick motions, he released the trapped air from the line, the same problem he had noticed nearly an hour earlier. He never explained what he was doing. On the next stroke, clean water flowed through the filter smoothly. The output nearly doubled. One student stared at the rushing water, then looked back at Silas. The answer to her unspoken question was written plainly in front of her. Silas simply nodded toward the shelter before walking away. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. Rain still hammered the trees. 30 people still whispered among themselves. But no one questioned who understood survival anymore. Some questions don't need answering once reality has already spoken. That quiet understanding settled over the group like the heavy clouds hanging above the ridge. Marsh stood motionless near the edge of the clearing. His rain jacket remained only half-zipped. His jaw tightened. His thumb rested against the clip of the multi-tool on his belt, pressing it once, then again, before letting go. For a long moment he looked at the shelter. Then at the students safely gathered beneath it. Finally, his eyes settled on Silas, who was kneeling beside the entrance, calmly preparing a fire beneath the dry overhang using feathered curls shaved from the same piece of deadfall. Behind him, the water filter continued running perfectly on its own. Exactly as it should have from the beginning. No one laughed anymore. Marsh started across the rain-soaked grass. His pace was nothing like the confident stride he'd shown all morning. Water dripped steadily from his jacket. The phone that had rarely left his hand was nowhere to be seen. He stopped a few feet from the fire. Close enough to feel its warmth. Not close enough to pretend he had helped build it. "I called it an antique," he said quietly, making sure every one of the 30 students could hear him, "before I'd seen what it could actually do." He never rushed to defend himself. He didn't search for excuses. Instead, he looked up at the shelter where rain continued sliding effortlessly off the overlapping pine branches, keeping everyone beneath them completely dry. Then his eyes shifted toward the water filter, now flowing cleanly and twice as fast as it had all morning. "I built this course believing the right equipment solves every problem," he admitted. But today showed me something I forgot. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, the first movement all day that wasn't polished or rehearsed. I never left room for the possibility that the person matters more than the gear they're carrying. Silas quietly added another small branch to the fire. He waited until the flames caught before speaking. His voice stayed calm. There wasn't even a trace of satisfaction in it. Good equipment has its place, he said. Just don't mistake having more options for having more experience. He wasn't trying to lecture anyone. He simply stated a truth that life had already taught him long ago. The rain continued tapping gently against the shelter roof. Water followed the same paths off the pine needles that Silas had designed from the very beginning. Marsh looked around at the students. Every one of them was watching. "I'd like you to stay for the rest of the weekend," he said. "Not as another participant." He paused. "As the instructor." Silas didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the fire burn steadily beneath the dry overhang. For a few quiet moments, no one spoke. Then the silver-haired grandfather stepped forward. His attention wasn't on the fire. It wasn't even on the shelter. His eyes settled on the old blade resting across Silas's knees. He studied the worn crossguard with remarkable care, tracing the patterns left by decades of use. Finally, he looked up. "That knife once cut me free," he said softly. "A different jungle. A very long time ago." Silas met his eyes. He never asked which jungle. He didn't need to. Some memories reveal themselves before names ever become necessary. The two men shared a silent understanding that no one else in the clearing could fully appreciate. Neither of them explained further. Some stories carry too much weight to be retold for strangers. Some debts remain just as meaningful without being spoken aloud. The group stood quietly, sensing there was history between the two men that words could never properly capture. The old knife resting across Silas's lap had never earned trust because it offered dozens of features. Again. And again. And again. Real confidence isn't created by marketing. It isn't measured by the number of tools folded into a handle. It's built through years of work, repetition, hardship, and moments when failure simply wasn't an option. A tool proves itself one difficult day at a time. Just like the person carrying it. If you believe equipment tested under real pressure means more than gear that's only impressive on a store shelf, let us know in the comments. And if you own something that's earned every scratch and every mark through years of honest use, we'd love to hear what it is. This community exists for people who understand that trust can't be purchased. It has to be earned. Silas quietly slid the blade back into its worn leather sheath. He banked the fire until it burned low and steady. Then he sat beneath the shelter, watching rain flow exactly where he had intended it to go. Behind him, the demonstration table had been forgotten. The expensive gear remained untouched. More than 30 phones had stopped recording Marsh long before. Not because anyone told them to. Because they had already found a lesson worth remembering.